Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Uncle Teddy Bear, and this is Uncle Teddy Bear's Feast. Today, we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson. When this episode is published, it will be just over 2 weeks away from American Thanksgiving, and also a month and a half after Canadian Thanksgiving. So I decided to delve into the history of the two and compare the two, as I know there's a lot of misconceptions about both holidays. And when I mean that, I mean by people who think one was before the other and whatnot, things like that. So let's dive in to the evolution and the origins of Thanksgiving in Canada and the United States. Now, you might be surprised to learn that while these two neighboring countries both celebrate Thanksgiving, their histories, dates, and even reasons behind the holiday are quite different. So let's jump into a tale of two Thanksgivings, one rooted in safe landings and survival, and the other in bountiful harvests and unifying a divided nation. So, first up, let's start in Canada. The very first Thanksgiving in Canada, as far as historical records show, actually predate the US version by over 40 years. Back in 1578, an English explorer named Martin Frobisher held a small ceremony in Newfoundland to give thanks after surviving a perilous journey through the icy, treacherous Northern Passage. This Thanksgiving wasn't about a harvest feast. It was simply a gesture of gratitude for safe passage and survival in an unfamiliar and dangerous environment. Think about it. They had no idea what lay ahead in this new land, and they had just braved one of the harshest regions on Earth. Over the years, the tradition of giving thanks grew among Canadian settlers. The French settlers who arrived in New France brought with them their own customs, including days of Thanksgiving to mark bountiful harvests and other blessings. By 1879, Thanksgiving was officially declared a holiday in Canada, although there wasn't a set date for it yet. It was celebrated at various times in November, usually after the harvest season had ended, but in 1957, the Canadian government made a final change, moving Thanksgiving to the second Monday in October. Why? Well, Canada's harvest season typically ends earlier than in the US due to the northern climate. And the change also helped avoid overlapping Thanksgiving with Remembrance Day on November 11th. So Canadian Thanksgiving is a blend of many traditions, giving thanks for survival, celebrating the harvest, and acknowledging good fortune. And interestingly, it reflects a slightly more humble, harvest-based celebration that feels grounded in Canada's diverse natural landscape. You might find turkey, mashed potatoes on Canadian tables, but you may also find local twists like salmon on the coast or wild game in rural areas. Now, let's head south to the US, where Thanksgiving has a different but equally fascinating history. The Thanksgiving story we know best is the one that begins in 1620, when the Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower, landing in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Their first winter was brutal. Nearly half of the Pilgrims died from cold, starvation, or illness. But in the spring of 1621, and I apologize if I say this wrong, the Wampanoag people, who had lived in the region for generations, helped the Pilgrims learn how to plant corn, fish, and harvest native plants. By fall, they had a successful harvest to celebrate, and they held a 3-day feast with around 90 members of the Wampanoag tribe. Again, I apologize if I said that wrong, and I most likely did. This feast, marked by sharing food, friendship, and gratitude, is what most people think of as the first Thanksgiving. It's interesting, though, because that 1621 feast was just one event, not an annual tradition at the time. For over a century, Thanksgiving days were sporadic, proclaimed by individual colonies or churches whenever there was a reason for collective gratitude, like the end of a drought, a military victory, or even just a good harvest. There wasn't a standardized Thanksgiving tradition in the U.S. until much, much later. Enter Sarah Josepha Hale, a writer and editor who believed passionately in the power of Thanksgiving. Hale saw the holiday as a way to unify the nation, and she campaigned for nearly 40 years, publishing editorials, writing letters, and petitioning presidents. Her dedication finally paid off in 1863 when President Abraham Lincoln, hoping to bring some sense of unity to the divided nation during the Civil War, declared Thanksgiving a national holiday. He set the date for the last Thursday in November and encouraged Americans to gather in gratitude, putting aside differences for a moment of national togetherness. Even Lincoln's proclamation didn't set the date in stone, though. It wasn't until 1911 that Congress settled on the fourth Thursday in November, following a request from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR wanted to move the holiday up to extend the shopping season and help the economy during the Great Depression. The decision stuck, and it's been the official date for American Thanksgiving ever since. So we have two Thanksgivings with two different roots. Canadian Thanksgiving began with Frobisher's safe landing and evolved into a harvest celebration tied to Canada's earlier growing season. In the U.S., Thanksgiving was born out of that 1621 Pilgrim Wampanoag feast, then became a unifying holiday in the face of Civil War, and later adopted to the economic needs of the time. And what about today? Thanksgiving traditions in both countries look similar, but reflect these unique histories. In Canada, Thanksgiving is a bit more low-key, celebrated in October, and less commercialized than in the U.S. The meal often includes turkey, stuffing, and potatoes, but many Canadians include dishes that reflect local flavors, like salmon or wild game. I know in Newfoundland there's usually a lot of moose to be found. And with the Jigs dinner, which I've covered in a previous episode. In the U.S., Thanksgiving has grown into one of the biggest holidays of the year, marked by parades, football games, and a giant meal, typically centered around turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie. But there's also been a growing movement to recognize the complexities of Thanksgiving, especially around Pilgrims and Indigenous communities. So while both countries celebrate Thanksgiving as a time to gather with loved ones and reflect on gratitude, each version reflects its own unique history. It's a reminder that sometimes the same idea, in this case, giving thanks, can take on a very different meaning in different places. That being said, thanks for joining me on this journey through Thanksgiving history. I'm Uncle Teddy Bear. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Uncle Teddy Bear's Feast. If you did, please subscribe, share it with a friend who loves learning about the stories behind our traditions. Whether you're celebrating in October or November, here's wishing you a very happy Thanksgiving.